Wars don't begin on battlefields. They begin in boardrooms, behind closed doors, in the silent calculations of leaders who believe, genuinely believe, that they've thought of everything. Charlie Munger spent his life studying why smart people make catastrophic decisions. Not because they're evil, not because they're stupid, but because they're human. And the Russia-Ukraine-America conflict? It's a textbook case of what he warned about. A predictable cascade of psychological misjudgment wrapped in the language of national interest. This isn't a video about who's right or wrong. It's about why conflicts like this are so hard to start and so impossible to stop. Because as Munger said, I never allow myself to have an opinion on anything that I don't know the other side's argument better than they do. Let's apply that standard here. Not to pick sides, but to understand the machinery of human error that makes wars like this almost inevitable. Charlie Munger didn't study war. He studied incentives, psychology, and systems. But his mental models explain war better than most strategic doctrines, because war is fundamentally a human decision, and humans are wired to fail in predictable ways. Munger identified over 25 psychological tendencies that distort judgment. Let's focus on the ones that turn disagreements into bloodshed. Incentive bias. People act according to their incentives, not their stated principles. Show me the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome. Commitment and consistency bias. Once you've invested heavily in a course of action, backing out feels like admitting failure. So you double down. Social proof and tribalism. We align with our group. Logic becomes secondary to loyalty. Ego and reputation. For leaders, personal humiliation becomes indistinguishable from national defeat. Confirmation bias. We see only the evidence that confirms what we already believe. Ignoring second-order effects. We focus on the immediate move, not the chain reaction it triggers. Now let's map these onto three actors: Russia, Ukraine, and America. Not to judge them, but to understand the psychological machinery driving each one. Every actor in this conflict operates within a different incentive structure. Understanding those structures is the key to understanding why logic alone won't resolve this. Russia's leadership operates in a system where showing weakness is existential. In authoritarian structures, perception of strength is currency. Losing face isn't just embarrassing, it's destabilizing. The incentive? Avoid the appearance of defeat at almost any cost. Munger would call this the ego trap. Once a leader publicly commits to a course of action, reversing feels like admitting error. And in systems where leaders don't face competitive accountability, there's no mechanism to force recalibration. Add in sunk cost fallacy. The more resources committed, the harder it becomes to walk away. Every soldier, every ruble, every diplomatic bridge burned becomes a reason to keep going, not to stop. And here's the second-order effect Russia may have miscalculated: economic isolation. Short-term military gains can create long-term strategic weakness. But when you're inside the system, those costs feel abstract. The immediate incentive, maintain authority, project power, dominates. Ukraine's incentive structure is entirely different. It's defending sovereignty, identity, and survival. The cost of compromise isn't just territorial, it's existential in a different way. Surrender means losing nationhood. This creates what Munger called social proof amplified by tribal identity. When the entire society is unified around resistance, individual doubts disappear. The incentive to fight becomes culturally reinforced at every level. There's also no political upside to compromise. Any leader who suggests territorial concessions faces internal collapse. The incentive is to hold firm, because the alternative, being seen as the one who gave up, is politically fatal. And here's where commitment bias escalates things. The more sacrifice a society endures, the more meaning must be extracted from that sacrifice. Every loss demands justification, and that justification becomes, we cannot let this be in vain. So the stakes rise with every passing month. America's incentives are more diffuse, but no less powerful. Geopolitically, there's an incentive to weaken a rival without direct confrontation. Economically, there's an incentive for defense industries and strategic suppliers. Politically, there's an incentive to appear decisive, to support democratic allies, to avoid appearing weak on the global stage. But here's the psychological trap Munger would highlight. Distant consequences feel less real than immediate benefits. Sending aid feels low cost in the short term. The second-order effects, prolonged instability, economic ripples, the risk of miscalculation, feel abstract. There's also commitment creep. Once you start supporting a conflict, pulling back feels like abandoning an ally. The incentive becomes to stay involved, even if the original rationale has shifted. None of this is unique to America. It's how great powers operate. They optimize for near-term strategic advantage and underweight long-term blowback. Now let's talk about why these conflicts become so hard to end. Munger had a phrase, "The iron prescription is to avoid being like the frog boiling in water." He meant that humans adapt to worsening conditions incrementally without realizing how far they've drifted from the original plan. That's what happens in prolonged conflicts. For leaders, ego isn't vanity, it's the operating system. Walking away from a costly conflict requires admitting miscalculation. That's not just politically dangerous, it's psychologically unbearable. As Munger observed, the human mind is a lot like the human egg. It has a shutoff device. When one sperm gets in, it shuts down, so the next one can't get in. Once a narrative locks in, we're defending national security, we're resisting aggression, we're protecting democracy, contradictory information doesn't penetrate. The mind defends the story it's already told itself. Wars activate tribal psychology. Once identity is engaged, logic takes a back seat. Each side sees only its own suffering, its own justifications. The other side becomes abstracted into a threat, not a collection of humans also trapped in incentive structures. Munger warned about this constantly. I think the human mind is a lot like the human egg, and the human egg has a shutoff device. When one sperm gets in, it shuts down so that the next one can't get in. It's the same with belief systems. Once tribal identity fuses with a conflict, you stop processing information rationally. You process it to confirm what you already believe. Every side curates its own evidence. Russia sees NATO expansion as provocation. Ukraine sees resistance as moral clarity. America sees involvement as supporting international order. None of them are hallucinating. They're selecting the subset of reality that justifies their position and ignoring the rest. Munger's antidote? Steelman the other side's argument. Understand their incentives so well you could argue their case better than they can. But in war, that's almost impossible, because understanding gets confused with endorsing, and so the fog deepens. Here's the tragedy. Most wars have multiple exit ramps, moments where de-escalation is possible. But leaders don't take them. Why? Munger hated sunk costs. He'd say, sunk costs are sunk, move on. But humans don't work that way. The more you've invested, money, lives, credibility, the harder it becomes to admit it was a mistake. So you throw more resources at the problem, hoping to justify the initial investment. Every leader in this conflict has sunk enormous costs. Walking away now means admitting those costs were for nothing. That's psychologically intolerable. For leaders, reputation isn't just about ego, it's about power. The moment you're seen as weak, challengers emerge. Domestically, politically, sometimes literally. So leaders optimize for looking strong, even if the strategically rational move is to de-escalate. Because in the short term, the cost of looking weak exceeds the cost of continued conflict. Munger understood this in business. CEOs cling to failing strategies because admitting error costs them their job. The same dynamic plays out in geopolitics. Only the stakes are measured in lives, not stock prices. The deeper you go, the harder it is to turn back. Ukraine can't negotiate away territory after so much sacrifice. Russia can't withdraw without domestic upheaval. America can't pull support without looking unreliable. Each is locked in by their own prior commitments. Not because they're irrational, but because the incentive structure punishes retreat more than it punishes persistence. Munger called this being in a hole and still digging. The rational move is to stop, but the psychological and structural incentives say, keep digging, because stopping means admitting you shouldn't have started. So what would Munger say about all this? He'd probably start with one of his favorite principles. Invert. Always invert. Instead of asking, how do we win? Ask, what would make this unwinnable? The answer? Letting ego, tribalism, and sunk costs drive decisions, instead of dispassionate analysis of incentives and second-order effects. Munger loved the concept of systems thinking. He'd say, it's not the people who are broken, it's the system they're operating in. Russia, Ukraine, and America aren't led by cartoon villains. They're led by humans trapped in incentive structures that reward escalation and punish de-escalation. The system is functioning exactly as designed. That's the problem. Munger also believed in admitting what you don't know. He'd say, I'm not entitled to have an opinion unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people who are in opposition. In this conflict, each side knows its own story perfectly, and the other side's story not at all. That asymmetry guarantees misunderstanding. And misunderstanding guarantees prolonged suffering. And the lesson isn't that one side is right and the other is wrong. The lesson is that conflicts persist not because of facts, but because of the psychological machinery that processes those facts. And until leaders on all sides recognize that machinery and choose to override it, nothing changes. Munger spent his life teaching people to recognize their own biases, to understand incentives, to think in systems, to avoid the traps that make smart people do catastrophic things. The Russia-Ukraine-America conflict isn't unique. It's a case study in what happens when those principles are ignored. Incentive bias, ego protection, sunk cost fallacy, tribalism, confirmation bias, second-order blindness. All of it playing out in real time. As Munger once said, "I think it is undeniably true that the human brain must work in models. The trick is to have your brain work better than the other person's brain because it understands the most fundamental models, the ones that will do the most work per unit. The models are here, the patterns are visible. The question is whether anyone in power will choose to see them. Because wars don't end when one side wins. They end when leaders decide that the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. And right now, the incentive structures say, keep going until they don't. Show me the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome." Charlie Munger. The incentives are clear. The outcome is predictable. The only question is, who will be the first to change the system?